Saba Innab's Station Point, curated by Omar Berrada. We are really happy to have the artist talk with you this afternoon. We share it all together, and Reema, she's a writer and researcher focusing on the artistic practices from the Middle East, will be here to connect and also present Omar, who had been the curator in residence here, funded by the KfW Stiftung, and Saba as an architect, artist and urban researcher, I would say, acting out, practicing out from Beirut and from Amman, brought here together really a very poetic, but especially also politic approach on how power and architecture are related. And I'm really looking forward to go more deeper into, on the one hand, that ongoing story of the violence, let's say, in the modern architecture. Happy to have you here, and Reema will introduce into the two, since she knows her work very well and is deeply affected.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you. So thank you to IFA Gallery for inviting me to take part in this wonderful and complex exhibition. And special thank you to Nicola and Stefano, wherever you are. So I'm thrilled to be joined in conversation with the curator of Station Point, Omar Berrada, and artist Saba Innab, and thank you all for coming to this talk today. So as mentioned, my name is Reema Salha Fadda, and I'm a writer, researcher, and editor. And much of my writing has focused on the political economy of Palestinian art and the appropriation of Palestinian symbolic space. So culturally, architecturally, and more recently, the pernicious role played by technology to conceal the invisible violence that is working to reshape the cultural narrative of Palestinian cities. So as such, this exhibition, Station Point, deals with a lot of concepts that I deal with in my own work. The politics of power and exclusion, the dialectical tension between visibility and invisibility in the context of historic Palestine, how we rethink inherited knowledge, and how inherited knowledge and cultural forms are reappropriated by those who wield political and economic influence. And more importantly, how this can translate into immaterial and material violence for people or places who are bound to power inequalities. So having known Saba's work and followed her working process quite intimately, she is an artist who, in my opinion, is not about the cheap frills or sexy slogans, but something more subtle, more laboured, and what I would call a process of considered hard graft, not just in material terms, but conceptually. And I overheard someone saying at the opening that this show is both conceptually and emotionally powerful. But I would add that it is materially powerful too, from the letter on the wall behind you, to the sketchbooks that lay out reference points that detail material and symbolic destruction of Palestinian land, and perhaps more generally the architectural violence of perspective, to quote Omar, to the monumental structure that brings together the themes of the show behind us. So this exhibition, Station Point, comes under the umbrella of the transdisciplinary project Untie to Tie, which was initiated by IFA Gallery with the aim of reflecting on colonial legacies, movement, migration, and the environment. Such themes seem to be further complicated in the Palestinian context that Saba's work reflects on, given Palestine is caught in an ongoing process of settler colonialism. As such, it is not a post-colonial state, but one in the deep grips of settler expansion and a rapidly eroding landscape, all the while Israel continues to be celebrated as a democracy in the region. So, to give the exhibition context, my first question to you, Omar, is how did you encounter Saba's work, and how did you both work together to develop the themes that this exhibition explores?
Okay, well, thank you, Reema.
Sorry, long intro.
Thank you, Inca for introducing us all and having us here in the space. And thank you to the whole team of IFA Gallery, Anna, Stefano, Nicola, Matthias, Eve, all the people who helped us install and everything. And a special thanks to two people who are not here, Alia Sebti, from whom the invitation initially came, and Driz Xikis, who is a writer and friend from Morocco who had started discussing with Alia a project named Hudud, which was hosted by IFA Gallery in February, and through which also some of these initial contacts were taken. It's going to be difficult to answer in a short way your question, but I first encountered Saba's work in Marrakesh. I'm from Morocco, and it was in Marrakesh in the context of the Marrakesh Biennial, the last edition to date, which was in 2016, so about 3.5 years ago. And her work was, so it was like often in biennials, it was in different locations, and her work was in the Badia Palace. I'm not sure how to translate Badia, but it's the kind of it has a sense of monumentality and luxury to it, this Badia
Magnificent.
thing. Magnificent, yeah. And it's in fact what it is now, it's a 16th century palace, and what it is it's a magnificent ruin in a way. And a very large, magnificent ruin. And there were a number of artworks in it that curators tend to like to try that space, but it doesn't often work because it's such an incredible place that it makes a lot of artworks look insignificant in some way. And that was not the case for Saba's work, in my view. It was two large plaster, I don't know if she would call them sculptures, but structures, certainly, that were these kinds of strange, impossible spaces. One of them was this horizontalized staircase that whose functionality couldn't be conceptualized, and the other one was a kind of filled-in Strait of Gibraltar, so an extruded, filled-in Strait of Gibraltar. In any case, there was a kind of very enigmatic and enticing materiality to the work and to the scale of the work in relation to the space that it was in. And we met during that opening week. We had coffee, and we didn't really stay in touch. It was kind of more of a distant mental staying in touch, but we didn't correspond or anything. Saba had sent me some information about a later work of hers that she did in France called Poetry Will Not Be the House of Life? Tomorrow, Poetry Will Not Be the House of Life, exactly. Which was a take on a work by Constant, Tomorrow Poetry Will Be the House of Life, and it was, in fact, thinking of it now, it was related to this in some way because it was a critique of a certain kind of avant-garde idealism in some way, European avant-garde idealism. So I was very struck by that project, by the way that her models, her architectural models work in relation to historical research and art historical research, the way that the writing worked in relation to drawing and to a practice of architecture that was kind of similar to a practice of sculpture in the way that it presents itself in a space, etc. So that when I was contacted by IFA Gallery to curate a show here in the context of this Untied to Tie, and the annual theme was about movement, displacement, belonging, and behind it were all of these current questions in the European, maybe political and media landscape, the figure of the refugee, all of these things. So I wanted to engage these questions sincerely, but in a way that that was maybe more seriously and deeply critical and political than, say, humanitarian or anything like that. And so, for some reason, which I couldn't really explain, while Alia was talking to me about this, I immediately thought of Saba. And I said, I think I know, I want to propose this artist and do a solo show. And so basically I contacted Saba, she was interested, we started a conversation. The idea was initially to keep working, to pursue projects that she had started, because her work is kind of, I see it as a constellation of concepts that take different forms and go in these directions that are different but always linked, and that deepen a certain engagement with a specific number of concepts, I think, and realities. So we start working. She sends me, you know, these long updates and explanations about her different projects, which was very illuminating and fascinating. And we start discussing, and then last summer, so this is why I'm saying that it's difficult to answer your question, is that the initial conversations were more than a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. It was a while ago. But anyway, last summer I was in Paris, and there was, at the Centre Pompidou, there was this exhibition on Vitebsk, a city in the former Soviet Union, 1918, when Marc Chagall is invited to create an art and craft school, and he invites Malevich and Lisitsky to go teach there. And the exhibition is kind of this saga of Vitebsk around 1918, the Russian Revolution, how, you know, Malevich becomes the guru, Chagall has to leave, all of that stuff. But anyway, something maybe in the politics, but also just in the aesthetics, the visuals of some of the work of Lisitsky and Malevich made me think Saba would really like to see this exhibition, I think. So I took some pictures and sent them to her by WhatsApp or email, I can't remember. And without thinking that this would change entirely what the show, what the project would be. And maybe you can take it from there.
Yeah, so basically, as Omar said, we had a proposal working on extending on a project that I was working on, mainly dealing with extraterritorial space and the meaning of architectural element in the extraterritorial space. So how do you extract a column in a specific context, and then once you see it out of the extraterritorial space, how it changes its meaning and the meaning of authority and so on. So it was different ideas, and then suddenly this image, I received this image, and I was in parallel working on the love letter to Malevich, because it's something that I've been wanting to work on for a long time. It's like a personal task I put to myself. It's something that I wanted to do since 2015. And last summer was suddenly...
Just to say, for those who haven't had a chance to actually see the show before the talk, the letter to the famous love letter to Malevich is the text that opens the show on the other side of this blue wall in Arabic, and on this side is the English translation of it and some annotations.
Yeah, so the love letter was written in Arabic as a very intimate document, but then once it is translated into English, it becomes more of an X-ray of the love letter. So you see all the footnote and the research and the or the annex, how I would like to call it, that had affected the content of the letter itself. So so I wanted to write this letter since 2015, and the purpose always changed. Yeah. So was it about I don't know if everybody,
a summary. So as they mentioned, the show takes the figure of Malevich, the pioneer of Russian avant-garde abstraction, as a departure point. I guess to rethink the pernicious power that lies behind abstraction and its forms. Are you leaving? So the letter presents an emotional reflection, which the curatorial statement alludes to as an impossible or torturous love. But it also points to a strong political statement that speaks to the broader politics of the art world that is increasingly gaining momentum. So it begins with Saba's refusal to take part in a retrospective exhibition on abstraction and politics from 1915 to 2015 at the Whitechapel Gallery in London. And the title of the exhibition, Adventures of the Black Square, referred to the work of Kazimir Malevich. And so she withdrew due to funding from the Israeli embassy in London. That's correct, right?
Right.
Yeah. So Saba's withdrawal was a subtle and perhaps forgotten footnote to this exhibition, because you mentioned that it went ahead and you were still in the catalogue, which maybe you could speak about in a bit. But it also becomes a generative starting point to explore several real themes that I would say I look at in terms of the political economy of the art world. So, you know, who funds art spaces, who funds artists, and specifically for Palestinian artists like Saba and those from the region who can't enter Israel, or even those in the broader international community who are seeking to resist the normalization of Israel's settler colonial project, it becomes a very torturous, I suppose, and also kind of immediate reaction when funding is obviously being given by the state. And I guess it got me thinking broader in terms of this idea of the cultural boycott. And we see it taking momentum in large-scale exhibitions like the Whitney Biennial. But when it comes to Palestinian boycotts, there's which is part of the cultural, I guess, narrative. It's a key part of our cultural resistance narrative. It's often met as a device of politics.
Can I stop you?
Yeah, please do.
So just to pick up, so I mentioned this letter to Omar, and what is this coincidence? You sent me this picture, and I'm working on this, and he was like, tell me more. Can the show be about the letter? And I was like, yes, if you want to. And this is how it all shifted the direction. So yes, the letter, it is about, I was saying that I couldn't do it before because the purpose was always changing. Is it about the fact of, it's not really boycott in like the common sense. It's about refusal or rejecting normalization with occupation, basically. But it is something that we do before boycott was, a kind internationally recognized. So,
and even here, it's a subtle footnote. It's still not the central.
True. But then, is it about this rejection, or is it about being actively withdrawing from something? And is it about this meeting that did not take place, or is it about the impossibility of being written in such history? So it was always changing, and at that moment last summer I felt that I am close enough to be able to write this. And the interesting thing is that the work that was supposed to take part in the Whitechapel Gallery was also withdrawal was really implicated within this work. It's a project I started working on since 2011. I guess it's still going, and it's responding to a project I worked on in real life as an architect. So there was a camp, a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon, in the north of Lebanon, that was completely destroyed in 2007, and I joined the reconstruction team to work on it. And so the meaning of architecture practice on the ground had actually, I don't know, it was confronted, how do you rebuild a camp, Aslan, and like, it's a bizarre notion. How do you rebuild something that is supposed to be temporary, but you are building it with master plans, with infrastructure, with international donation, huge money, through security planning, to be demolished again. So it is like a very intense process that led to something that I still work on till today, which is the notion of dwelling in temporariness that is constantly mutating into a permanent state. So this generated a project titled How to Build Without a Land, and it is about the rejection of architecture in its current state because it's not able to deal with, such notions. So How to Build Without a Land is about this, and it was supposed to be in this, well, it is in the catalog, but it's not there because it was too late it was already printed. So somehow to take a distance from this project and from this incident and this letter, somehow refusal and rejection was actively always present, but also it's about radical nostalgia, if I may say. Like, it's about thinking critically, being critically nostalgic to such school of thoughts.
And it does have this very emotional quality to it, and I guess that was a hook for you call it a three-part structure, but in a way you can read this exhibition in kind of layered ways. It doesn't necessarily follow a strict structure, but I'm interested in that kind of, structural narrative that you've articulated this exhibition with.
The articulation came from Saba, really, but the starting point was when she started telling me about this project, this kind of letter. I mean, the way I heard it and the way I
Yeah.
still hear it is there has been a missed encounter between Saba Innab and Kazimir Malevich. Meaning, in 2015, this encounter that was supposed to happen at the Whitechapel Gallery in London on some kind of non-neutral, neutral ground did not happen. Several subtexts to that. One is that Malevich has been important to Saba in some extent in terms of aesthetic, I don't know, upbringing in some way, right? It's kind of work that has had some significance, or that constellation of work, let's say. What interested me is that there seemed to be more than this kind of missed personal encounter. Of course, it's not missing an opportunity to exhibit. That's really not the point.
Yeah.
But it's also not just that particular encounter at that particular moment in time and place in an exhibition. It's more that it seemed that in that missed encounter, a lot was implicated. And it was not a missed encounter, it was in fact an impossible encounter. So this was what was coming out of it when I was hearing Saba speak, was that she was realizing, and maybe that was part of the difficulty of writing the letter, is that it's not just this kind of critical thing, it's realizing this very heavy historical, political reality of it is not possible, so far, for the history of avant-gardes in Europe, the history of abstraction, to include, let's say, Palestinian forms.
Sure.
Right? And it's in a way akin to the kind of questioning that was present in her work before about extraterritoriality and architecture and architectural history. What is it about architecture as a discipline and as a discipline of authority that it cannot allow itself to consider as part of its history forms that could be, you know, things built in refugee camps?
Yeah.
And so a lot of Saba's work has been about, she calls it collecting spaces or collecting forms, collecting, let's say, architecturally extraterritorial forms in a way, right? And first of all, working with them, making them visible, and asking the question of their possible inclusion within a history of architecture. You know, and what would happen to architecture if it agreed, if it realized the necessity or the importance or the interest of including these kinds of forms. And so for me, it's the same question with art, with Malevich. And one of our questions became, which is a kind of a reference I had brought into the picture, there's a Palestinian philosopher, anthropologist, thinker called Ismail Nashif, who has this book which has not been translated, it's only in Arabic. The title translates as something like Threshold for the Opening of the Episteme. So there is a kind of Western epistemology, you could say, of art, of thinking, of historical narrative, all of that. And he's kind of wondering how you could open that epistemology to include narratives that it excludes. And how does the Western episteme, or how does modernity, and modernity is always Western, modernity is always colonial, what does it look like if you look at it from a space that it has always marginalized? What does it look like from Palestine? I'm getting to. So what does it look like from Palestine? Palestine being the with a big T-H-E margin, in the sense that modernity is a failed project because it has always failed to include Palestine. So what does it mean to look at it from there?
And sorry, no, you.
No, just so small, because this was actually very important, and it's funny how it slipped in the cracks while we were, because it was a very important starting point, and somehow it transformed for me. Like somehow I found an intersection with this idea, and I was asking maybe, how does modernity look if we look at it from permanent temporariness? Because there is also something about the exclusion of some of the meaning of the temporary. Like, so basically, as a Palestinian from Amman, for example, this is a narrative that is always excluded from the Palestinian narrative, and the Palestinian case in general. So yes, it was very crucial. this book and this notion.
And I guess it's interesting that you're saying, because it is an itinerant identity, you kind of don't have you called it a blind spot to Palestine in a way, which invites a different kind of perspective. Working in Beirut is a different kind of Palestinian narrative. Working from Amman is a different, working from London, so it kind of has that layered histories. But you both touch upon something that I'm no expert of Malevich, and actually I was saying to Saba, I came across his work through two Arab female architects, Saba and Zaha Hadid, who saw him as a very kind of, I've canonized her now. That's how the history of architecture goes.
Finally canonized Zaha.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, Zaha, not you. No, but it's interesting when you hear her speak about Malevich, because she sees it as a complete rupture with the authority of a fixed perspective or a fixed gaze, and so it's kind of this anti-dogmatic form that she was able to adopt to experiment with. And so whereas you see abstraction as a sort of pernicious violence, as you've spoken about, and that's what the letter will talk about, maybe you can introduce this idea of how you open up to thinking about Bauhaus and its adoption as a narrative in the Israeli context. But for you, you're almost, by highlighting the kind of violence of abstraction, and you put it really beautifully. You said, I understand this fact when I realize the subtle violence that reveals itself in the loftiness of abstraction, in the negation and erasure implied by such loftiness. In these lines and forms and aesthetics, I know intimately and masterfully. And there's a kind of real pain in the way you're describing your like it is quite tingly, you know, you get very emotional reading it. And so I feel like you're doing two things. On the one hand, for me, the exhibition invites a reflection on the role of the architect to be inspired by and to inspire new architectural forms of knowledge, which we can talk about a bit later. But also, so to not see abstraction purely as liberatory, but to also see the violence. And I guess what I kind of read it as is part of the aim of this exhibition, partly, not fully, to present an alternative architectural history in terms of exposing modernist complicity in these kind of more violent forms, and also rejecting the idea of architecture as a potentially utopic space. And so maybe you could reflect on the Bauhaus part in that, or however you want to answer it.
I would say yes. But maybe reflect on the Bauhaus part later.
Okay, sure, we can do that.
But yes, sure,
because one of the things you mentioned is, and this is one of the things, actually one of the key reference points for the exhibition, which is a book so complex I can't summarize it, but it really is a fantastic read. White City, Black City, and it basically, Omar, you'll probably summarize. Actually, I'll do your summary. You want, or you do it.
This is an opportunity. Mentioning the book is an opportunity to mention Nicola Hartl, who's back there and who organized the space that is that room to the left, which is not technically part of the exhibition, but which functions in conversation with the exhibition. It's the research room. It's called Resonances, which is the research room and the kind of public program. And it has a certain number of books, printed out articles, magazines, etc., that she selected in conversation with us, and this book is in there as well. What can I say about it? It's, of course, we're not going to summarize the book, but it's a book by an Israeli architectural historian, let's say, who has decided to study deeply this notion of Tel Aviv as the white city, the Bauhausian city, which is something that is well known about it, let's say, or has been a natural kind of narrative of Tel Aviv now. And he's saying at least two things. One is that Tel Aviv was never known as the white city, or had not been in this way linked with Bauhaus before 1985, and 1984, which was the date of an exhibition organized in Tel Aviv by an architectural historian called White City, which kind of constructs this narrative, and so which becomes, it's a moment when an exhibition establishes something that becomes kind of like a historical fact, at least in the popular consciousness. And the second thing that the book is important for is, and it's in its title, White City, Black City, is establishing this dialectic or this relation between, while Tel Aviv is being hailed as the white city and as the inheritor of the Bauhaus, in a way. The Bauhaus that has been obliged to close its doors, to go into exile and all of that. And so its legacy is found here in Tel Aviv. What goes at the same time is Jaffa or Yafa, which becomes the black city, basically, in a way. So it's like this kind of what is the dark face or the dark underside of this white city narrative.
And actually, you touch on a really important point in this idea of the exhibition being an almost scientific, rational officialization of the narrative, which...
just to say, officialization to the extent that then the city of Tel Aviv applies to be... the white city of Tel Aviv becomes a UNESCO recognized World Heritage Site, etc.
Yeah. Exactly. And so interesting to think of this exhibitionary space as the potential to kind of disrupt that narrative, but also one of the things that's really beautifully put in the curatorial statement, actually I'll paraphrase it, is to translate an alternative politics of space. And I wondered, and maybe this kind of comes back to the idea of the three-parter or the kind of structure of the exhibition, because it's a in a way, very subtle exhibition. You have the letter and then you have the sketchbook, which includes, well, Saba, you can actually describe the sketchbook that kind of looks to quotes and images that, as footnotes and reference points to your architectural practice, I suppose. So maybe that's a good thing to point to now and kind of describe that.
Yeah, I think the sketchbook is actually taking a distance from the letter. It is a representation of the distance from the letter, because to be able to read or to dismantle this notion of honesty of the material that is very present in the letter, but also present in the modern architecture discourse, that it is about, you know, it is like the foundation element of it is the honesty of the material, the industrialization of architecture, where, you know, the classical doctrine had collapsed and is replaced by this, but also it is a way to dismantle the change of the or the redefinition of the notion of the truth in architecture.
Right.
From Vitruvius to Mies, Vitruvius is like the first architectural theorist we know of, and he was discovered or reinterpreted in the Renaissance period, and many architects read and illustrated his themes, doctrines, notions of the meaning of the ideal city was built on his ideas. The perspective was invented, the one vanishing point perspective was invented at that point. You know, all of this was really necessary, was a necessary distance to understand what kind of authority that is implicated in the planning and in architectural theory, regardless of how you redefine the truth or how you redefine the honesty of the material. There is something that is always present. And just a side note that is not at all a side note, that Vitruvius, yes, he is an architecture theorist, but also he's a military engineer. Yeah. So somehow centrality, authority, control, panoptics are really, really implicated in all of this. So you have the sketchbook that is more of like, not a commentary, it's more like another X-ray of this maybe, and the models respond to the sketchbook, to the panoptic also. Three, are there 5 or 4 models?
I think it's 5.
So four of the models are from are based on the ideal city plans transformed into panoptic objects, but one is based on the first moshav.
Oh yes.
Nahalal.
Yeah. Do you want to? Because I just want to break quickly to say, so according to Vitruvius, a building must have 3 major properties: strength, functionality, and beauty. And I was saying to both of them earlier, Saba also introduces the kind of ugly truth to architecture as well. And what's interesting about the sketchbook is there are a lot of quotes and academic reference points that look to how Israel used architecture, but also public space, and this idea of building public spaces through parks or even museum sites as a form of settlement expansion or as a form of control over the landscape, but they're using this rhetoric of like green and open public space. And for example, when I went to Safad, which is in the north, they kind of use this idea of we're the recycling city, but it's a city that has been cleansed. Actually, I was speaking to you yesterday, you said it's been recycled of everything, including its Palestinian population. So you have a really interesting series of quotes that I really would urge people to really reflect on as to how built landscape is being very much appropriated, and also the moshev, which if you want to talk about, because it's included in the sketchbook, isn't it? Maybe introduce people to what it is, because
it is the first plan. So basically, the sketchbook is composed of archival material that are retraced by carbon paper, basically. Because it's the simple solution to presenting archival maps, and quotation from from different books. So it's not really about making links. You make the links. It's just by placing different
reference points.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was the first moshav is basically was in 1924, I think, and it was built on the garden city concept, but it was not represented as it was built on the garden city concept. Of course, it was presented as this very new and since new then legitimate or legal, because novelty is always also illegal or an official official point.
And they were, sorry to interrupt, they were collective farming land, so they had this sort of utopic notion of, we come, we build, we rear the land together, profit is equally distributed. So it's similar to the kibbutz, but I think they had a different kind of profit structure where some was given to an authority or public services. So it kind of, again, it's what you're saying is these ideal cities or these ideal spaces are similarly built on histories of destruction, erasure, but it's given a kind of nice PR branded.
But I think it's also, there's that, but there's also what's important in the narrative that Saba has built and in the notebook or the sketchbook is the continuity, is the fact that this new kind of plan of the settlement is, as researchers have established, kind of directly copied from an English garden city plan. So it's like this kind of this kind of continuity between Vitruvius, Renaissance ideal city diagrams, English colonial architecture, etc., etc.
Which was happening at the same time, based on garden city principles as well, and this return to nature was also something globally taking place, but it's on the surface it is return to nature, but it's also radical nationalism, it's Marxist, but it's also occupation, it's tabula rasa, but through agriculture and erasure.
And again, this issue of funding also came up in one of the, the World Zionist Organization were also relying on funds internationally to kind of develop these spaces. So you have that whole complicity, like you were saying, from kind of other Western powers, I guess. So we're going to turn to this epic, monumental structure behind me. And I suppose one of the things in our conversations, you were talking about you've mentioned it already, but the kind of truth of the material. And I wondered, and there's an iron filing which you can maybe talk about, like what do you mean by this idea of the truth of the material?
Honesty
of the material, sorry.
Honesty of the material is basically to use the material for the purpose that it can perform.
Right.
So you don't. It's simply you don't clad, you don't force a stone to be a column, because it's not natural. It's not made naturally to be a column, This kind of simply.
Right. And it was hailed as an important architectural principle.
Of course, You just use a thing for its purpose, natural purpose, and it's for, So honesty of the material itself is something that again I abide by, but also. What does it mean in the context of the Roman?
Sure.
And honestly and genuinely, this is a question that keeps, looping in my head.
Can you say more about it?
Because I don't know if I can say, really, it's like, it's an obsession, but I mean, I feel like it's self-explanatory. I don't know, but I don't know if I can elaborate but maybe the iron work can give a, for example, this piece is what happens when you cut metal, iron in particular, with a grinder, and if you can accumulate the powder that the metal powder on a surface, this is what happens. Because of the heat, it accumulates. If you can have a surface and if you're able to accumulate, this is what happens. So it seems a very organic and natural shape, but it's actually it is something that happened through man-made destruction of the material. This is in another way to say this is like the thickness of the cut.
Right. Yeah.
So this is iron. And it is related to the destruction of the material, but it is iron. And what does this then mean? I mean, yeah.
So it kind of reflects its own destruction, or its own sort of morphing.
Yeah, it does.
But I wonder whether you could speak a bit more about this structure, because it's very imposing, it's very monumental, and I kind of read it as a sort of visual synthesis of these negotiations that you're trying to explore kind of in the earlier parts of the exhibition perhaps. And this idea of how to construct an alternative visuality by disrupting the perspective. So rather than looking at it in the middle or vantage point or above, I'm not an architect, so I'm probably using the terms badly. You've kind of lowered, so you think of a city and you traditionally think of the skyline, and the skyline is a way to kind of identify the city, whereas you're taking things below and you're forcing us to look down in a material that is traditional to the Arab region, which I hope you can speak more about. And so this kind of forcing us to look down, it plays into your exploration into the idea of visibility and invisibility, and I know you've looked at that in other projects as well. And for me, of course, it invites, and for you, it invites a reflection on the informal economy and the tunnel trade in Gaza as well, which is obviously for Palestinians who are under siege, who have no access to air or land, it becomes an alternative way to link to the, to establish an economy and a lifeline.
Yeah.
But of course, in the international community, it's seen as a sort of, well, it's completely delegitimized and vilified. But here you see the underground as a site of potential, not necessarily in the tunnel sense, but you're changing the perspective, and I wonder if both of you actually could speak.
Well, the tunnel is very present in my work recently, because it is also this question about the meaning of architecture in the context of ruin as well, as if this tunnel as a structure in the extraterritorial space, and for example, how you take an arch and if you put it in the underground, it is completely functional, but once you see it on the ground, above the ground, it's more of a grand gesture to authority, to architect. It's an architectural gesture. So to go back to the tunnel, as if I'm looking for as if the only possible architecture in this context is this active withdrawal, actively withdrawing rather than being or actively being invisible, as a
sort of strategy of survival, but also
but more subversive, not passive. It's actively being invisible. Actively being invisible. Yeah.
All right. Do you have
actively invisible?
Yeah.
I don't know. The way I think of it is, especially in looking at this, which Saba has always called, since we started talking about the possibility of this, a spatial intervention.
Right.
So this is active. The activity is present in the term. It's not an installation; it's an intervention. And it seems to me it's what she has constructed here intervenes or acts on the structure that's above it. So basically, what this is first of all, there is a structure, which somebody was asking earlier, is not part of the IFI gallery. It was built here last week. but it is a structure that constructs a single vanishing point. It is, as I say in the essay, it's not a particular structure. It is perspective as structure. And then this, which is made of out of a certain number of blocks of claustra that maybe Saba can speak about it later. Were cut in different ways, and then she spent the install time. A lot of the install time was Saba basically making this piece by piece, sticking the pieces together, trying different combinations. It was really made here out of a certain number of elements that were pre-thought, like intuitively pre-thought in some way, and then studied and all of that. But then the exact manifestation of them has been built here on site. So, as you said, there is this important question of levels, that is to say, taking things closer to the ground, and perhaps there is a part of the intervention that is below ground, and you can't see it, but you know. But it's also playing. So one of the ideas, I think, is refusing the single vanishing point, refusing this kind of panoptic view, refusing the possibility of mastering the landscape from a certain place. So you can look, and it gives you the illusion of horizon or perspective, and then it gets interrupted, and then you have to move around and look from a different angle, and then you have to keep moving, and you can never see everything, and you can never master the space. One of the ways we can read it, I think, is this idea of refusing the bounds of what excludes you. Because these columns, like, they really construct frontiers in a way. Like, they master the space on a large scale, but it's like they give you these solid points. And the intervention kind of goes beyond and between and maybe underneath. I mean, it kind of... I think for me, it's very much related to this notion of refusal, in the sense of it's not just withdrawal. And maybe refusal and withdrawal are a bit different.
Yeah.
And maybe refusal is the act of withdrawal, is the refusal in a way, but it's a refusal that's not just negative. It's a refusal that, at its core, is the building of an alternative space or an alternative mode of dwelling, basically, an alternative way of conceiving visuality. So it's not just a critique in the negative sense, you know, like this is what, you know, I don't know, this is what Western architecture has done and all of that. That's not, I mean, of course it's part of the point, but it's not the point. The point is what is possible, right? And what is possible in the ruin still, in a way. And we were talking about it the other day, the fact that this is a kind of a futuristic ruin landscape that was built in a very, you know, handmade, one by one kind of, like with old methods in a way. So it's kind of this, and I think it is partly, I mean, when Saba talks about how to build without land, or when she talks about this kind of strange temporality of the permanent temporariness, of the temporary space of the camp that becomes permanent, I think it is a kind of complex temporality that is both past, present, and future. Like it forces you to all of these travels in time at the same time. So it's kind of what I'm interested in, what I've been interested in Saba's work from the beginning, is the fact that that architectural questions, that questions of space are at the same time questions of time, of how we live in time, and you know, whether, I don't know, it's kind of corny to say whether future is possible, but what is our relation to the past and the future? I mean, when she was talking about, what was it? Radical nostalgia. That's also this kind of bizarre temporality. What is radical nostalgia? So these are some of the ways I think that this can be understood. A kind of fugitivity, I think, is a term that I like, and that also is, I mean, that I have thought about more maybe in the context of black radical thinking, like people like Fred Moten or others who have thought of you know, blackness as fugitivity, as refusal of that which refuses you in a way, like as the under commons, under this, under that, like what happens in those other spaces.
And what knowledge can be gained, because one of the reference points you have is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and of course that's a text which I've looked to in my own work about how you play with that invisibility as well. So what can you learn by evading what's visible in front of it? And I guess that's sort of what you're playing
with. And a space where you don't have to be bound by this by critique as always confronting something else. So it's a space where you can envisage something else.
And Saba, I wonder whether you can talk about, because one of the essays, the curatorial essay, it says about the use of claustra and how it's often with a folklorizing impulse that obscures their technical and symbolic significance in the region's architecture. And you're using it, I mean, if you could just talk about the material itself.
I'm interested in general in the embedded knowledge in the building material, and since hence the honesty of the material also is really connected to that. I'm interested in the references, in the migration of the material, and the meanings, and
where it's traditionally used.
Of course, but also what kind of references it can provoke. So basically, I'm borrowing this very domestic material, commonly used in circulation spaces. So there's it is related to movement and it is related to domestic space. But then you're slicing it, you're cutting it to form another landscape, basically, a spatial idea that is very much related to maybe creating, depending on the epistemic structure that is, related to the material, you're somehow maybe hoping to create another epistemic structure through the destruction of the material.
And I guess also the reappropriation in new contexts as well.
Of course.
Right, I have to check how we're doing for time.
Uh-oh.
Should we open it up? Yeah, if anyone has any questions, speak now.
Go ahead.
Yes.
For all we know, the heat might have eliminated everybody else anyway.
There's one here.
Yeah, we have three.
Okay, thank you for the beautiful show and the comments. So really inspiring. I'm really I have a lot of ideas at this moment, but there are two things that really struck me during the conversation. One is this connection between Malevich and Middle Eastern architects, female architects. There's something
maybe you can
interesting. I got to know Malevich through Saturday and that brought me to.
They need to be Middle Eastern female and have 2 A's in their first name. That's the
But that actually brought me to think. I couldn't really turn, so I had to look at the picture and to go to the letter on my phone. And there's a passage from a really surprising passage from Malevich, painting flat, to architecture, spatial construction, Tel Aviv, city, urbanism. So we go from 2-dimensional, white and white, to right away 4-dimensional historical object, city, collective. From the very individual, mystical, because for Malevich there was a whole mystical 4 dimensions. So we go from there, from this really handy object to a massive quasi-hyper object, historically deep Tel Aviv, as a mega, another one of modernism. So that's one really interesting leap I wanted to emphasize. The other one is that when and you guys, I told you guys, I was really surprised with the installation. I was I felt it was really enigmatic spatially. And the funny thing is that I don't find it monumental at all. Actually, it all looks like some sort of model, but for ruins. So, there is something monumental about ruins intrinsically because they are invisible remnants. But here, it looks like ruins, therefore, yes, monumental, but kind of like a model for ruins, like something that is a tester, or something like that. So then in the back, which is the last thing I happened to see, then you see things that look more like models. So there's this tension between the model and the ruin and the large-scale model, or something like that. So, okay. But I'll stop here. These are 2 lines where this goes, and I think
Can I make a comment on your second comment? So it's basically, so I don't think it's monumental either. I think this is Reema's impression, and you're completely entitled to that. But I like the fact that you said you use the word model, because I don't think I make sculptures, for example, because what I can do is a model, basically, and it is true. It is a model for a ruin. Something you describe it really well. Thank you for that. Yeah.
It was actually a question.
It was a question?
No, I mean, like, it was an invitation to give us more information about the practice you have of models and ruins and your own experience.
Okay.
And, just to delve on that.
Okay, so it is always a question about time and space and the reference of the material. So I always move between the three elements, but it takes different shape every time. For example, the project Omar mentioned, Tomorrow Poetry Will Not Be the House of Life, is actually about collecting architectural moments, perspectives. Basically, also the idea of the perspective is something that I use normally in my work, because we are not creating. My intention is not to create a model of a space, because a model is always maybe a model for something to be built. Not necessarily to me. I think a model is like a representation or a prototype of an idea that, can remain an idea, an unbuilt, unfinished, unrealized idea. But for example, in that project, it is the reverse. I am collecting spatial narrative that is related to the notion of the permanent temporariness beyond the camp. I think this is very crucial to stress, that it is about this condition that the architecture space that is complete, or the dwelling that is related to the state of suspension, whatever space it occupies. So it can be a camp, but also it can be a modernist building somewhere in any place in the world. And this act of collecting these moments and representing them in models is really about creating an epistemic structure, or as Omar described it, another history line, maybe that was rejected by the history of architecture, like the official history of architecture, but it is about demanding or reclaiming modernist architecture to be part of my narrative as someone who's collecting the permanent temporariness architecture. So it's not really about alternative, maybe, but I can't find another word. It's about reclaiming. And reclamation is something very crucial also in the letter. Who can reclaim what? And I think the shift in the letter that you mentioned, the link is the heartbreak, I think. But also, if you want to look at it abstractly, it is the black and white, and then the white and white, and then the black and white of Jaffa and Tel Aviv. And abstraction is a violent act of erasure, whatever it is. The subtraction and the extraction that is implicated within. So to go back to this, yes, it's like a constant exercise of discovering what the material can do and stripping it of its essence in a way. You're cutting it, you're destroying it, you're adding another dimension to it, and. Yeah.
Just to say one more thing about this kind of break or passage in the letter is, I think the letter, just the text of the letter itself, openly claims its, how would I say this? Doesn't need to explain in a way. It's a letter. It's from Saba to Casimir. Or to Malevich.
Oh wait, it says dear Malevich, no?
Yeah, right. Dear Malevich. So no, but it's from Saba to Malevich.
You're right.
But it's true. He's not. His first name is not there. It's true.
We're not that close yet.
We're not that close. Yeah.
You don't know each other yet.
But what I mean is, what it puts forward is a kind of emotion, right? It's a kind of, it's written in a kind of literary mode, in a mode of emotion. And in that sense, if I'm writing a letter to somebody, be it Malevich or whoever, you know, it can go in whatever direction, right? But then what happens is the footnotes and the end, like all the notes that are here, plus all the quotes in the notebook, are the kind of, if you want, they kind of give you a hint of all of the historical, political, geographical, architectural realities and research that I wouldn't say that the letter is based on, because precisely it's not based on them. It's like the temporality between the letter and the notes is unclear. You know, it's unclear if the notes come after or before or in the middle or whatever. And I think it's all of these. But I think in a way, like, because I asked Saba a bunch of questions about the letter also, like as when she first sent it and then as she changed it, and including elements, subtracting elements and all of that. And I remember there was a phase when I was trying to make it be logical, like I was trying to make it be like some kind of an argument. And then I had to, you know, I understood that this is not the case. Like that if it makes an argument, it's not a rational, scientific argument. Even though it was also very important for Saba that everything be substantiated and justified. Like every single thing that it says, or every single word, like none of it is said by chance or without being weighed in some kind of way. So it's kind of this tension between a certain mode of address and the kind of critical historical claims that are implicated within it. But that implication is constructed through the whole show, not just the letter, basically.
But also, how would you mention or address the letter to Malevich, and how do you mention Bauhaus and make the show not about Malevich or Bauhaus?
Right. Yeah.
This was also something very crucial, but you have to go through all this, you know, material and but still be focused. But this is not about Malevich, you know. It's like, but it is the focal point, it is the starting point, but it's not about that also.
But
so yeah.
It's also like I was like you, I kind of wanted to know the links, and I got frustrated with my own lack of knowledge or desire for that knowledge. But I think it's really reflective of how you read the show too. You build it up, but it's also how you experience things or moments, or you know, the withdrawal of an exhibition and then the kind of seeing of a painting, and then, like, it's all very promiscuous in its thought process, which is why it reads so emotionally. And I think even in the gestures to the footnotes or the architecture, you're bringing many different dimensions to your practice, I think. And it kind of, yeah, it's like we piece it together as much as the books in the room or the footnotes. So it's...
But it is an emotional letter.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, it's like, it was never...
An official.
It is, I mean, but somehow, yeah.
Which is interesting, what this emphasizes is the fact that architecture itself has emotional grounds, not theoretical. Like in the way you present it, it's really not about understanding the architectural gesture or the form, right? So that's what this whole thing brought me to. It's like, okay, well, now I understand we should not be looking for a historical statement or something that would be like a critical argumentation, but rather this is an emotional where these ideas are.
True.
Or both. Or maybe that's what is meant also by this difference or this unbridgeable gap between building and dwelling in a way. True. There is a form of conceiving of architecture as this link to science and rational activity of creating spaces which is this authoritarian activity that discounts the dwelling, which is maybe the emotional experience of space, and which is not just emotion. It's an emotion that within it has knowledge, constructs. I mean, you know, it is not. I mean, there is no contradiction between knowledge and emotion.
Yeah. I also think the way I read it, when I first read it, there was something about it where, because I've thought a lot about this role of cultural icons or how you respond to your teachers or this kind of cultural influences, and when they make a bad political move or they're implicated in a negative politics, there is that real divorce. It's a very difficult sort of like a violent withdrawal as well, because they become a different representation of what you imagine them to be. So it's that idea of what you say about the disappointed love is a very kind of knowledge-producing emotion as well. And I think in more general cultural terms, if an icon lets you down, you do have that very kind of emotional response to it.
Yes, but it's not also about that.
Yes.
It's really about, I think it is about who can reclaim what and on what basis, basically. So, yeah, and it's not really about idealizing.
I don't know, like, I was just thinking, like, my reading of this may be based on what you said about also, like, destroying this material and evoking this idea of a ruin is also bringing that which is beyond the vanishing point, or which is usually, like, that which usually occupies the blind spot into the foreground, which makes this idea, to me at least, a bit confrontational, especially within this context where, especially if we're talking about the German left, like Israel is always the blind spot, right? And, or more often than not. But also I wanted to ask you something, because you spoke of this idea of an alternative mode of dwelling, and it reminded me of this notion that I came across while reading, one of your texts on how to build without a land, I think, and which is the notion of poetic dwelling. And I was wondering if this was sort of also in the background with this project, or if you can elaborate on this in relation to that.
No, a poetic dwelling is a Heidegger terminology. So it's about. It's actually about the impossibility of dwelling, or the gap modernity created between building a dwelling, to an extent that even poetic dwelling is the only possibility. That poetic dwelling is the only possibility. And I was in How to Build Without a Land, precisely it was, a proposition that when you are in exile and refuge in this permanent temporaneous state, even the poetical dwelling or poetic dwelling is impossible. So it's just a proposition.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Final reflections?
Yeah.
Omar, Saba?
No, I have nothing final to say.
Okay. So,
Thank you.